Hello super friends and welcome to DC TV Talk, and in today's episode we're going to be breaking down and reviewing Supergirl Season 4 Episode 3, otherwise entitled Man of Steel. And before you proceed with this review, make sure you've watched the episode before you watch this review, as it will be filled with spoilers. So this episode pretty much picks up immediately where last episode left off, where we saw the filter device that was used in the Season 2 finale basically disperse kryptonite into the air, and therefore having Kara indisposed for the entire episode. And it's really interesting because Supergirl and Kara, Melissa Benoist, she's hardly in this episode, and that's because this was the time when Melissa Benoist was actually still filming or performing on Broadway, so she wasn't actually here, as they actually filmed this episode. This was actually the first episode they filmed, as they didn't actually have Melissa Benoist available. I believe it's this episode and the next episode they didn't actually have much of Melissa Benoist, which is why she wasn't in this episode much, and why she won't be in next episode much either. So it was quite an interesting dynamic between the characters to see, them all interact without Kara. Now, while this episode is called Man of Steel, that name does not actually refer to the Man of Steel himself, Superman. This actually refers to Benjamin Lockwood, who is one of our major antagonists for this season. This episode is completely about him. This is his entire origin story. We get to see Sam Witwer pretty much in every scene, minus a couple, and this is all about him. And we actually get to see him with his family. You actually see his father is very anti-alien, and it's almost filtering in, like you get to see him living with his family and how they are basically trying to live their life, and, they just have, Benjamin Lockwood's dad, who's basically just constantly going on about how, aliens are roaches and how they are invading, there shouldn't be their planet and things like that. And this is basically planting the seeds for what we can expect with Benjamin Lockwood later on down the road. Now, Ben Lockwood as a character, I thought was fantastic in this. One of the things I think is most intriguing about Season 4 of Supergirl is the character of Ben Lockwood and Agent Liberty. I think that's such an interesting idea to bring to the show, and especially because Sam Witwer is playing him, who I think is a tremendous actor. So to see him introduced here and have his own origin episode, I thought was a brilliant idea for this show. Really give it something a bit different, a bit fresh, and I think this was a great episode of Supergirl. I really do, but I'll get into my overall thoughts at the end of the video. But overall, for Benjamin Lockwood as a character, I loved him. I love the fact that his father, was a real inspiration and a real sort of, hero to him, and the way that his father's company was actually in partnership with Luthor Corps. I thought that was really interesting. Like, this character in Benjamin Lockwood actually has ties to Lena, and I think that's really interesting as well. I'm sure that will come into play later on. And also, he's a teacher at university, which is, something we haven't really seen before, and, especially in terms of like a villain. I mean, I guess you could say on The Flash, obviously we saw that with Clifford DeVoe last year, but this is something a bit different, and I think this is a really fresh idea, especially something to bring to Supergirl, which is really different. And Sam Witwer is absolutely fantastic in this episode. He's so good, giving such a fantastic performance. There are times, especially the scene where he's talking with James, I really found him to be very much like Stephen Amell, actually, in the way he was doing it, and that's most certainly not a bad thing. I don't want to compare him to Stephen Amell, I don't want to compare him to anybody, but, that's what it reminded me of, and I like the way he was performing it, the way he was delivering the lines, what he was doing with his hands and his body movement. It was very like what Stephen Amell does with Oliver Queen. And I just thought he was fantastic overall. So convincing, so real, so grounded, and I just loved everything about him in this episode. I think he was, such a strong introduction. I thought it was brilliant. Now, this episode is basically an entire flashback, minus a couple of scenes where we do focus on Kara and how they're trying to fix all that situation. It's basically taking place over a few years, and we see flashbacks about how this character of Ben Lockwood, how he descended into the character we see him now as Agent Liberty. And one thing I absolutely loved was that this character has been seeded throughout the history of Supergirl. This character has been in all these major events. For example, we see his family home get destroyed during the Daxamite invasion of the Season 2 finale. So he was actually around during the Season 2 finale, and we see him actually get affected by that on a human ground level, which is something that Supergirl's never done before, and something that a lot of superhero shows don't really do. It just doesn't show how these big battles actually affect the common people. A good movie that represented this was Captain America Civil War. That movie actually tried to, go into that and did it very, very well. And I think Supergirl did it very, very well here. We see Benjamin Lockwood, they're trying to move out, they're trying to get away from the alien invasion, and it actually turns out their home gets destroyed as they're doing that, thanks to the Daxamite invasion. It was a fight between Jean and a Daxamite that blew up their home, and this was just one of the many things that starts to turn Benjamin Lockwood into a bit of more of an anti-alien activist. And again, just the fact he was part of that event, I thought was super interesting and really well, a clever writing technique from the writers. So after this event, he starts to become a bit more anti-alien, and during one of his university lectures, which he does also teach aliens as well, he basically goes on pretty much a xenophobic rant about aliens, and he then gets complained to basically the board of directors, and he then gets fired from his job at university. And this was yet another thing that, just piles on top of him. This guy goes through a lot over these few years, and this is just the thing that keeps piling up and piling up on top of him, and him getting fired was just another thing on top of the pile. And similarly to his link to the Season 2 finale, he was also heavily involved in the Season 3 finale as well, which I thought was really interesting. We do get a few reused shots, but I guess that's kind of to be expected here. But what I really liked was that, his father basically sacrificed himself in order for his cause, in order to stand up against the aliens, and I thought that was really interesting. And this was the final kind of kicking point, was his father's death. This was the final kicking point that really turned him into the guy that we see him as now. And again, I thought all this stuff, the fact that he's been seeded throughout all this different stuff is really interesting. He was around since Season 1. Even at the start of the episode, you see him with that ending speech from the Season 1 finale, where Supergirl is talking to the world. You see that. Then you see him in the Season 2 finale, his family home gets destroyed, and then you see him in the Season 3 finale, and his father dies. And I think, again, all these things, it was just so well handled, and I really loved all of that. This was such a realistic depiction of a downward spiral. This was such a really well written, really well handled way of doing it, because I was a little bit worried. Obviously, Supergirl has not been on to a good start. I did not like episode 1 or 2 at all. So I was a bit worried about how they were going to handle Agent Liberty. Although he was the most interesting part to me, he wasn't really focused on in the first 2 episodes, despite a couple of teasers. But this was such a well-written way of doing it. You actually see how this was literally a downward spiral where one thing after another just kept hitting this guy, and he kept just, getting all this stuff piled on top of him. He went through a lot in the space of about 4 years, and you really see how this has impacted him and turned him into Agent Liberty. And I think that was a really interesting way of doing it, and giving him his own flashback episode was a great idea. We even see how he's connected to other characters. He's connected to Lena, he's connected to James, and I think that's really interesting as well, giving him these little connections to other characters. He's even interacted with Kara before. We see that in this episode. There's just so much good stuff going on here with the writing, and I thought it was so fantastic, and that's even more elevated by Sam Witwer's performance, which, like I said, was brilliant in this episode as well. And what I really like as well is how this just ties into the main story, because while you see him slowly turning into Agent Liberty, you see him get picked up by Mercy Graves, and you actually see how that whole thing happened. You see how she basically convinces him to join her into the anti-alien kind of Semitism type thing. She actually gives him the Agent Liberty suit, so he gets it from her. And basically they join forces, and then we see how they led the attack on the alien bar. They managed to get that waitress who worked there, Jean's friend, and then he kills her. And you see how it ties into the main story, and it all ties up really nicely. Just the writing in this, I really have to commend the writers, which is something I don't do often on this show. In fact, a lot of the time I criticize the writers on this show, but I really have to congratulate them. This was so well written, so well, put together, and really well tied together. And I think this was just a brilliant way of doing and introducing Agent Liberty fully into the season. And on a little side note, we do see at the very end that Lena finds a way of basically helping Kara into a condition where actually giving her that sort of robot suit that we've seen in the set photos, the Power Rangers-esque suit. So we do see her kind of suit up in the episode, and the mask is completely black on the front, so you can't see who's in it. Obviously, this is to hide the stunt double that's going to be in it for most of next episode. But, I'm not really too bothered about this. It's just, it's just a way around of filming the episode without having Melissa Benoist available. It's just their way of doing it, and this was obviously their way of explaining why she was in that suit. That's one thing, if you were listening to the podcast or you're listening to my videos about Supergirl, I was really curious as to how they were going to explain the suit. So this is it. It's basically just it's kind of like a contamination sort of suit, to keep her contained and to keep everything from going in and everything from going out. It's kind of like one of those situations, kind of like a cryogenic freezer from Star Wars, if you want to call it that. It's kind of like that. So, they've explained it now, fair enough, whatever. I'm still not a big fan of the suit necessarily. I think it looks a bit silly, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see how it is in action next episode. But she has got the suit. We made it. Overall, though, I loved this episode of Supergirl. I can't believe I'm saying that, after a really disappointing Season 3, after a terrible Season 4 so far, if I'm being honest, I did not expect this episode to blow me away in the way it did. And I don't know if it's more, emphasized by the fact that I really have not enjoyed this season in the first 2 episodes, but I just thought the way they've done it all, it was just, like I say, so well written. really realistic in the sense, you know, this season has been plagued for being a bit more grounded, and this episode is where I really felt that, because again, you saw a realistic depiction of a downward spiral, and a really realistic depiction of how this villain turned into Agent Liberty, and you also get to see a realistic depiction of how all these events are affecting the common people, and how, you know, the character of Benjamin Lockwood was affected by the season 2 finale, he was affected by the season 3 finale, and how this actually affects common people, and took it really into a ground level. And again, I think this is such a really good episode of Supergirl. This might be one of my favourite episodes of Supergirl of all time. I think it's just really good, and it gets me so hyped for Agent Liberty for the rest of the season. I really hope this guy is a big presence, because he's been so well established here, and his connection to Kara, his connection to Lena, I think it's going to be really interesting going forward, and I think he's just a really good addition, and I really think Supergirl is lucky to have Sam Witwer on this season. Whether he sticks around for season 5, who knows, but I really feel like this is just, you know, we need to appreciate this guy while we have him, because he is such a talent. But what did you guys think about this episode? Make sure you let me know all your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you think this is the best episode of Supergirl so far this season? I think it most definitely is. Like I said, I think the first 2 episodes are quite poor. This episode was fantastic. I think it's such a good thing. Like, Supergirl, can we just forget about those first 2 episodes and just go from here? I'm willing to let those first 2 episodes slide and just start from this point, because I think this was great. This was a risky episode for Supergirl. They really did take a risk here. I respect that. And that risk paid off, in my opinion. And I think it was a really fantastic introduction to Agent Liberty. A great way to do the episode. You know, a good way to actually focus on something that's relevant to the story without having Melissa Benoist there to lead. I think this was fantastic. I loved it. I really want to watch the episode again. I think it's really good. And I just hope this quality continues going forward. So, thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like. It'll help me out a lot. And share this video with anyone and everyone you know who loves DC TV, and get them to join the community. And as always, guys, please subscribe for all of your latest content on Supergirl, The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, and Arrow. And with all that said, guys, hope to see you again in my next video.